Hello, and welcome back to the Corruptive Chaos channel. I'm your host Corbin, and today we'll be reviewing Elvis, which was directed by Baz Luhrmann and stars Austin Butler as the titular Elvis Presley, alongside Tom Hanks as his manager, Colonel Tom Parker.
I'm gonna show you what the real Elvis is like tonight!
If you're looking for trouble, you came to the right place.
So, here's yet another updated biopic about one of music's most famous icons, Elvis Presley. Personally, I came into the film really liking Elvis's music, and knowing that he did star in films. I haven't seen any of them. I know that his life was cut short in the late 70s. It's now been, since 1977. So a lot of people my age, or younger audience goers who maybe are going to go see this, like me, don't know much about the backstory to Elvis's life, his rise to stardom and fame, and what happened basically from the late 50s up through the late 70s when it came to his life and career. So with that said though, I don't know that there's too much to spoil when it comes to the plot. This is a real person's life, so you could have just looked this up anyway. I would say when it comes to the story, the script seems to focus a lot on his rise in the late 50s, and it is actually told through the perspective and eyes of Colonel Tom Parker, who is played by Tom Hanks. We'll get to that. And so the film actually opens up, oddly enough, on Colonel Tom Parker's deathbed in the late 90s, actually, where this character wants to sort of tell the real story, as it were, and say how he was unjustifiably maybe vilified, and that he wants to prove that he made Elvis Presley instead of ended up, causing his death in any fashion. And along with that, I've heard some critiques of this film call it sort of a Wikipedia biopic, where it's kind of just going through the motions through the eyes of Tom Parker. But I would have to disagree. I think it can be difficult to condense an entire person's life, if that's what you're going to go for as a filmmaker, to fit that into a feature-length runtime. The film does stand at 2 hours and 39 minutes. And with that, I would say, comes along some minor nitpicks. I would say we do skip over a large chunk. We kind of just say that things happen when it comes to maybe the early 60s. Colonel Tom Parker, in the government, they push Elvis to join the army, and he's sent off to Germany. And then after that, we kind of hit the beats of him getting married to Priscilla Presley, and then having a somewhat apparently successful movie career. And then by the mid-60s, his popularity begins to dwindle, and then eventually a large chunk of the film in the second half is spent on his sort of comeback, and then eventually moving to Las Vegas.
I wish to promote you, Mr. Presley. Are you ready to fly?
I'm ready. Ready to fly.
I would also say that critics who assert that the film isn't sort of a great biopic and how it tells the story of Elvis's life are maybe confusing Baz Luhrmann's really quick pacing and style. I think his style really lends itself to how the story is told. Chunks of it do sort of slow down and become dramatic. The tonal shifts maybe don't work as well as he wanted them to, but I think it does give it a really odd jarring juxtaposition when you're supposed to be feeling different emotions throughout the running time. I wouldn't say that that's a negative in my opinion anyway, but I think that maybe they're just confusing that we're skipping over parts when Luhrmann really has a desire to focus in depth at parts on other parts of Elvis's life. So then moving on to Baz Luhrmann, talking about him for a minute. He has directed films like The Great Gatsby and Moulin Rouge, among others in the past. He has had a bit of a gap since directing last. His last film was actually The Great Gatsby in 2013, so it's been nearly a decade gap for him directing. Personally, I'm not really all that familiar with his filmography, but I've heard that the really insane visual style and editing that is on display in Elvis is apparent throughout the rest of his earlier works. Now, this is the most probably subjective part, but I really enjoy Luhrmann's style, especially the editing. I mean, most blockbusters, or wide release films, I should say, are edited sometimes quite dull and boringly. A lot of times you just get shot reverse shots, or other times you get maybe just inserts that are probably just coverage of dull and maybe flat wide or long shots that, like I said, were just, you know, used there for coverage when maybe shots didn't quite work together in editing. But here you get many double exposures, interesting fades, all sorts of wacky stuff, and it combines really well with how the camera moves, which a lot of times can be jarring. For some people, I've heard it might be even nauseating, or maybe that's slightly hyperbolic. But to me, I really liked how wacky this looked, and I think the wacky nature of how it was shot and edited lends itself to maybe the wackier performances, like Tom Hanks, and the wackier parts of the story being told.
Been a lot of talk about the new Elvis.
Those people ain't gonna change me none.
Luhrmann's direction does make the film kind of weird, I guess, but I respect how weird it goes for. But still, at the same time, it is this glamorous retelling of Elvis's life. The production value, to me, was very high. The costuming, the sets, cars. I mean, this is obviously a period piece, you know, taking place, like I've already said, from the mid-50s up through the late 70s. So you want it to be period accurate at every step of the way, and I think that was definitely achieved. Now we can move on to our two main performances. We'll start off with the supporting actor, Tom Hanks. He is kind of fun to me in this more villainous role. Usually Tom Hanks plays really good guy type of roles, but here, as people have probably already seen, he's under a lot of prosthetic makeup and in a fat suit, and he has this, at times, over-the-top accent. But like I said, I think that over-the-topness of his performance lends itself to Luhrmann's directorial style. Also, I would say his accent is at times indistinguishable on where he's supposed to be from. In real life, Colonel Tom Parker, which was not his real name, he was from the Netherlands, from Holland. He catched a ride on a boat to the U.S. somehow. I'm not totally sure. It doesn't delve into the Colonel's life as much in backstory. But then he does sort of fit in nicely with a lot of the earlier segments in the South.
There are some who'd make me out to be the villain of this here story.
In my mind, it just feels weird that this Colonel guy, who really doesn't care all that much about music, he cares about managing people, really, that's what we learn. It feels weird that him and Elvis even crossed paths at one point, and that they worked alongside each other, maybe against Elvis's will, for decades. At times, Tom Hanks played the Colonel as sort of a mustache-twirling villain, at times, you know, reminding me of like Dick Dastardly from Hanna-Barbera cartoons or something of the sort. He does seem to really enjoy playing this maniacal, cartoonish villain who, you know, isn't just all bad. We do get to see how their relationship evolves, the Colonel and Elvis. But still, the movie is certainly on the side of Elvis, and that he was a performer who was used by his, you know, supposedly friend and manager, the Colonel. By the time that we get to like the mid-60s, when Elvis is starting to sort of lose his fame, a lot of that blame, in the film anyway, is put on the Colonel. And then later on, when Elvis wants to travel abroad, instead of just staying in Las Vegas, the Colonel shuts that down immediately. We later learn it's because he is not a citizen of the U.S. He does not have a passport. So in his mind, he always had this worry that he would be maybe taken away from Elvis by the law. So really, I wouldn't say his characterization is really two-dimensional at all. We do maybe humanize him more than I was expecting anyway. And still, like I've already said, I really enjoyed Hanks' performance a lot, actually. And I think the makeup effects were really good.
Tomorrow, all of America will be talking about Elvis Presley.
But with Hanks done, we can move on to Austin Butler, who obviously played the titular Elvis Presley. Now, after watching the film, I actually learned that Austin Butler had been working on this role and practicing all sorts of things for around 2 years. Obviously, it seems like he really committed himself to the performance, and I think that it totally paid off. I think, obviously, when you're making a biopic, a ton of whether the film works or not rests on the shoulders of the starring actor. A lot of times I judge a film from maybe the directorial style, how well it's made, and don't maybe put a lot of weight, as much weight anyway, on the performances as maybe other moviegoers and critics do. But I would say in a biopic, like I said, so much of it depends on that main actor. Can they pull it off? Are they believable in that role of a real person? And for me, as someone who, like I said, likes Elvis, I think Butler was able to fill those blue suede shoes pretty well. You know, in his training, he had to prepare to sing. He actually did sing in the film. That's his voice pretty much throughout the runtime. Learn how to dance, how to just walk as Elvis, his gait, how he hangs his body, and then work underneath it all in these elaborate costumes, makeup, and hairstyling. So I would just say that the mannerisms, how he looks, it is very spot on to how Elvis Presley looked in real life.
We can't go on together with suspicions.
Not to gush too much more over Austin Butler, but I would say this is probably my favorite leading performance of 2022 thus far. And like I said, if it was not for Austin Butler, even if it was directed well and the production quality was up there, it wouldn't have mattered if that leading performance was just okay or even worse. I think a lot of times when I was viewing him on screen, I wasn't merely seeing an actor. You know, I was buying into it. My suspension of disbelief wasn't being shattered at all. I was seeing Elvis Presley on screen in my head a lot of the time. So as I've already said, I think if you're unaware of Presley's life and career, this is a good way to find out more. I think I learned quite a bit in this. It does focus a lot on the Colonel. I don't know how much of a figure he was in the latter years of Elvis's career, and I do admit that it might skim through bits, but that was a decision made by the filmmaker. I think an entire film, in theory, could be made on just a year in Elvis's life, or just a part of him in Vegas, or just his rise to fame in the late 50s. But here, this is trying to tell a broad and big story, and I think that it succeeded very well. And plus, you know, this is really for fans of Elvis, so I wouldn't say it delves more into the negative aspects of his life. It does show him taking pills in the film, and, you know, having a lot of women sleeping around even though he's married with a child. But it doesn't dwell too much on those parts because that's not the goal of the film. It wasn't to tear him down. Like I said, it was to show a broad overview of his life as an adult and performer.
You looking for trouble? Look right in my face.
He had no idea what he had done.
And luckily, like me, there was plenty of songs throughout. Like I said, Butler does sing as Elvis. And, you know, you can't fit everyone's favorite song maybe into the film, but many are played. And they intertwine very well in the story. This isn't sort of a musical where musical numbers might come out of nowhere and almost come out in a surreal sort of fashion. The music is played so in a very normal way on how it would have been portrayed in real life. And, you know, getting toward the end of the review, something I don't talk about often is sort of the other department heads or other departments who work on a film. But I gotta say, this film deserves all the praise in the world when it comes to the production design, art direction, costuming, and hair and makeup especially. I think maybe even Hanks's, you know, look in the film could deserve some awards when it comes to makeup effects and prosthetics. Obviously, Elvis's iconic, many of them anyway, iconic jumpsuits are on display, which, you know, just adds to how real the filmmakers and costume designers tried to get to the real look of him you know, maybe over 40, 50 years ago. I think I'll end it on maybe just one nitpick, which would be that I think for a lot of the film, Austin Butler does look like young Elvis. You know, when it goes through the years, through the 60s and 70s, he doesn't age very much, I would say. He looks a lot like he did the character in the late 50s. And, you know, when we cut to his final performance in 1977, I think that's the only time where Butler looked jarringly different in the film. But I think, regardless, that's just a nitpick. I think the look of him as Elvis was pulled off really well. So here we are at the end of the review. I really enjoyed this film. I think parts of it will be controversial, like the directing style and Tom Hanks' performance. But I think I've seen pretty much universal praise for Austin Butler, which is awesome. And I'm going to give the film 4.5 out of 5 stars. So, thanks for watching, everyone. If you made it this far, maybe consider liking the video, subscribing, or leaving a comment down below on what your thoughts were on Elvis.
Our country itself is sick, that it's lost its sense of direction, even its common decency.